My thanks to the chair of this session and to my fellow panelists, Dr. Irene Al-Ben-David, and especially Anna Holzer-Kowalko, as well as to Professor Yifat Weiss for the kind invitation to this conference. I'm honored to be here. In September 1942, there appeared in London a festschrift honoring the very Reverend Dr. Joseph Hertz, who for nearly 3 decades had been serving as chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Empire. Some of the contributors to the Hertz festschrift were refugees from Hitler's Europe. These included Eugen Mittwoch, formerly director of the Berlin Seminar for Orientalische Sprachen. It would be Mittwoch's last publication since he passed away in London 2 months later, exactly 80 years ago. Chief Rabbi Hertz had labored hard to rescue these individual scholars, some veterans, other mid-career, and even young rabbi doctors. Under the auspices of his Religious Emergency Council, the auspices of the Office of Chief Rabbi, had been set up for this purpose. However, concerning the case of institutionally rescuing the Hochschule, denominational differences had dictated otherwise. For as Christian Hoffman and Daniel Schwartz demonstrated some years ago, it was Chief Rabbi Hertz who largely frustrated the 1939 efforts of Cambridge reader in rabbinics Herbert Lowe to salvage what was left of the Hochschule for the sake of institutional continuity on English soil. Hertz, however, had personally assisted Lowe in rescuing the Hungarian-born Talmudist Samuel Kraus, who until the Anschluss had been the senior member of the faculty of Vienna's rabbinical seminary, enabling Kraus to live out the final decade of his life in tranquility in Cambridge. This much one gleans from the opening paragraphs of Kraus's Hebrew language contribution to the 1942 Hertz festschrift. Entitled Sidur ul-Machzor miteiman ktav yad, it is just that, a thick description of a manuscript of rather recent vintage containing a tiklal, or Yemenite rite of prayer. The second paragraph of Kraus's opening statement is worth quoting here in full, and I translate from the Hebrew, beginning of quote. I have another reason for giving this offering to Chief Rabbi Hertz, because he is the man who has assisted refugees in this land, presumably England, taking them under his wing. And the manuscript at the basis of this study is like a refugee, or in the original Hebrew, ke'ein palitu, transferred from Yemen to Germany. And were it not for rescuing this artifact from the hands of barbaric tyrants, its destiny would be to perish from the earth. End of quote. There is a lot to be said about what is revealed in this paragraph and what is not. Kraus points to an affinity between his own circumstances as a refugee with those of a Yemenite Sidur purchased, he soon informs us, in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, by Karl Rathens, a Hamburg-based geographer and explorer, at some point during the 1930s. Rathens had deposited this artifact in Hamburg University's Oriental, currently Asia and Africa Institute, where Kraus had inspected it just before departing for England. In 1942, Kraus was clearly aware of how the Nazis had brutally destroyed the infrastructure of Jewish studies in German lands. He is clearly not yet aware that in civilized Europe, rather than Muslim Yemen for that matter, mass murder of the Jews has started to occur. The Yemenite prayer book that stands at the center of Kraus's 1942 study is actually but a footnote to an interwar and largely dovetailing German Orientalist and German Jewish effort of salvaging Jewish material culture from Muslim Yemen. This effort, after 1933, was partially relocated from Hamburg to Palestine and continued after the interruption of the Second World War in 1950s Israel, but I won't elaborate on this further. The Yemenite prayer book, however, that Rathens had redeemed, as he wrote in Hebrew, was hardly the first of its kind to find refuge in civilized Germany. Back in the 1870s, the Berlin Staatsbibliothek had purchased a number of these from an Ottoman Jerusalem-based dealer, convert to Anglicanism, and a clever rogue named Moses Wilhelm Shapira. With his innate gift for eyeing many, quote, unquote, genuine old manuscript hailing from Yemen, Solomon Schechter's words, the finds furnished by Herr Shapira had transformed entire areas of Wissen, schaft des Judentums until around 1900, until around the discovery of the Cairo Geniza. One Yemenite prayer book in particular, supplied by Shapira and cataloged by Moritz Steinschneider, serviced numerous scholars in search of lost poems from medieval Spain, a philological quest which peaked a century ago here in Berlin with the unfinished work of the Russian-born Hebraist Yaakov Naftali Simchoni. 2 decades later, in 1942, and while personally having escaped the catastrophe still unfolding, Samuel Krauss still seemed to be on the same page and on the same Yemenite trail. The body of his essay, however, reveals that Krauss had put the loftier philological agenda of reconstructing Sfarad via Yemen on hold for the sake of liturgically appreciating Yemen in its own right. No longer able to access the Yemenite prayer books in Berlin or Hamburg, he had found substitutes in the collections of English connoisseurs of Hebrew manuscripts from the Orient, such as Herbert Lowe, Moses Gaster, Elkin Adler, and the British Indian-born Baghdadi gentleman scholar David Solomon Sassoon, and even the young Cecil Roth. Starting my presentation with Samuel Krauss's 1942 modest contribution to the study of Yemenite Jewish liturgy seems perhaps a little misguided for the purposes of this conference, for in the wake of Michael Meyer's work, my original intention had been to elaborate on the intertwining fates of 3 refugee scholars from the Hochschule in the United States, Ismar Elbogen, Alexander Guttmann, and Abraham Joshua Heschel. Guttmann had risked his life to save some 60 valuable items from the Hochschule library, apparently with the hardly acknowledged assistance of veteran librarian Jenny Wilde. While on the HUC faculty, since Hebrew Union College faculty since 1940, the institution which had saved his life to begin with, he shared these books with no one. The Guttmann affair, mentioned previously, erupted in 1984 after he and his wife anonymously put up the bulk of these heirlooms for sale. A Sotheby's facilitated transaction was frozen by the Attorney General of New York, mainly due to the Hochschule library markings identified on the contested books. The settlement over deed and title was a Judaica Conservancy Foundation representing 6 institutions, including the Leo Baeck Institute, Hebrew Union College, despite its own counterclaim of sole ownership, as well as the Jewish Theological Seminary, the original purchaser, anonymously, of the gems of the collection. Guttmann and his wife were duly compensated. Behind the scenes, this compensation was organized by the then director of the Jewish National Library in Jerusalem. He also raised the funds to compensate Guttmann. Aside from his efforts in rescuing books from the Hochschule library, I have little more to say about Alexander Guttmann, Budapest-born and Breslau-trained, the final incumbent of the Hochschule's chair in Talmud since 1935. The literature I did consult suggests he was perhaps overshadowed in the role of instructor of Talmud by a junior faculty member referred to in several places as the Ostjud Dr. Kahana. Perhaps he's in the picture here, I don't know. I would love to get more details about him. One female student recalls that in the preparatory Talmud class, that Dr. Kahana was even willing to sneak a hint her way during oral exams, which suggests he was perhaps a very nice individual. I know nothing more about this fellow. Guttmann, however, was responsible for ordaining those who qualified for the rabbinate at the Hochschule. These included Heschel, a Warsaw-born former student turned colleague, also rescued by HUC in 1940. Ismar Elbogen's departure for New York 2 years later had not been facilitated by HUC, but rather by HUC, JTS, and Stephen Wise's JIR, or Jewish Institute of Religion. But the man behind the scenes was the then president of Dropsy College, Cyrus Adler, who also stood at the head of JTS until his death in 1940. Elbogen was appointed research professor and out of his office in JTS, labored on his scholarship until his death in the summer of 1943. By then, and with the catastrophe in Europe, the Holocaust, European Holocaust still raging in full, a distinctly Eastern European critique of the German Jewish legacy of Wissenschaft des Judentums was echoing nearby in the halls of YIVO. An initial evaluation of Elbogen appeared in the YIVO Blätter in 1944, penned by Judah Rosenthal, who had trained at the Hochschule under Elbogen. While complimentary of Elbogen as always having shown warm personal feelings towards his Eastern European students, Rosenthal pointed out that his former teacher consistently made sure that Eastern European Jewish history and culture were not represented in the Hochschule's curriculum. When asked why, Elbogen's answer, which to me, an Ashkenazi scholar of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewry, rings familiar, had been that there was simply nothing to study. The Hasidic-reared Heschel had also been trained by Elbogen at the Hochschule in the philological methods of Wissenschaft and subsequently been ordained by Guttmann. By January 1945, Heschel had had enough of Cincinnati and become quite alienated from the American heartland of classical Reform Judaism. His only place of spiritual shelter, besides the cafeteria, non-kosher, where he met an African-American cook who supposedly inspired his appreciation of African-American spirituality, was the library in HUC. World class. I don't know if it had clearly had no Hochschule books, since Guttmann was keeping those in his private residence, where ironically, Heschel was able to discover the writings of some of his own Hasidic ancestors. By the end of that year, Heschel had secured employment at Louis Finkelstein's Jewish Theological Seminary. However, with the Nazi-orchestrated mass murder wiping out the Warsaw of Heschel's youth, he addressed and delivered a eulogy at the 1945 YIVO convention entitled The Eastern European Era in Jewish History, an event which memorably brought a largely atheist audience not only to tears, but to its feet at the end, chanting a collective Kaddish. The original Yiddish of Heschel's eulogy was published in the YIVO later that year, but the lasting imprint was his 1949, Schocken published, The Earth is the Lord's, the Inner World of the Jew in Eastern Europe. Some scholars have scrutinized Heschel's deployment of the Hasidic tale in this work, others his own return to Yiddish. Seemingly all components of the Eastern European culture barred from the Hochschule by his German Jewish teacher, Elbogen. To this, I add a pointed reference of Heschel's to Elbogen's history of Jewish liturgy. Essentially, Elbogen had framed at the very end of his history any Hasidic prayer or any Kabbalistic devotion, inspired devotion to God, is hardly worth of discussion. The reference, Heschel's critical reference, although he does not name Elbogen, appears as a footnote to Heschel's own constructed binary of two great traditions, quote unquote. Medieval rationalist Sfarad, long glorified by the German Jewish enthusiasts of Wissenschaft, versus Ashkenaz and its Eastern European offshoot turning inward. Heschel, now, in light of the Holocaust, said, enough of the glorification of Sfarad, it's time to reaffirm our own Ashkenazi and perhaps Eastern European roots. During times of trial and tribulation, invoking binaries such as Ashkenaz versus Sfarad is useful in making sense of the more immediate past. But I should say this, that the historiography of Wissenschaft des Judentums continues in many ways, to be constructed via an internal European binary of East versus West. For Heschel, in this spirit, it was time to reckon personally with his teacher Elbogen, arguably the last icon of pre-Holocaust German Jewish Wissenschaft. In closing, I return to Samuel Krause's equation of his own circumstances as a Central European refugee in wartime Britain, he was Hungarian-born, with that of a Hebrew manuscript from Muslim Yemen finding sanctuary in initially civilized Germany. His rhetoric is worth amplifying, since it tempers, and here I, to some extent, continue the spirit of our keynote lecture, since it tempers and perhaps also relativizes the Eurocentric categories via which we interpret how the Holocaust globally transformed Wissen, schaft Judentums. With the closing of the Hochschule in 1942, the curtain had come down on a Central European, but also transnational infrastructure of rabbinical seminaries, libraries, periodicals, and monumental works of scholarship. 150 years since this institution's founding, we are still trying to comprehend the rescue of scholars, books, or both for that matter, from civilized Europe. Thanks very much.